What is up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Inspired By, a series where we break down the musical trends past and present to understand the techniques used so that you guys can make better music. My name's Will and I'm making an assortment of music under the moniker Hush Child. Now today we're looking at Fred again, who, by the way, just seems like the sweetest producer on the internet right now. You see him on his Instagram taking long train journeys across the UK with Skrillex and Fortet in hand, and he's just been making absolute bangers. So today I want to look at Fred again post his Boiler Room set, and I want to focus on the song Turn On The Lights Again. Now, Fred Again's discography is vastly different. You've got stuff that's a little bit more chilled, a little bit more drum and bass. Some of his stuff even sounds like the work of Old Burial. Turn On The Lights Again is an instant classic. So I didn't want to recreate it, but I've definitely kept it similar to the original so that you can still hear some of the theming. We've got a lot to cover, so let's jump into it. Right, Fred again and again and again. Now I've got a few things to show you in this project. We've got a lot to get through, but I'm also going to list some of the things that I didn't do well, some of the things I could have done better, because I think it's important for you guys to know where I was going wrong and how I recognized that. So without further ado, let's dive straight into the drum selection. I'm using a murder kick sample here. It just sounded most rounded when I was comparing it to the original track. Not too much EQing, just taking off some of the lows, and I've got an envelope follower, as we'll see later, which is tied to my bass. I'm using 3 snare samples next to get our snare sound, and these are all from Ableton. So first up, we've got the Hatton kit. You'll also be able to hear that there's a little bit of reverb going to the first send. Almost like a rim shot, that one. You can see that I'm rolling off just the low end stuff, but no panning going on, all kept in the middle. And the next snare here is called the snare bus ride, and it's a little bit more bassy, very tight. And then finally, we have the rim SS, and that's just giving it all this high end energy. You can hear most of the reverb coming from that rim shot there. All together. And then you can see that I've got this little ghost note here. I've just taken it down in volume, but we're using the Hatton kit snare once again. No reverb with that one. I've also got this little side snare. Every 2 bars, it just plays the first offbeat marker. You can see that I've got a snare group here. I'm just EQing the snare a little bit more just to round it off and have it sound a little bit more like Fred Again's track. I'm using a compressor here just to get a little bit more punch. So we're driving it quite hard, 3.7 there on the ratio, fairly medium attack, and a fairly quick release. Utility there just to take it down a dB. For processing, I'm grouping my kicks and snares alone because I want to do a little bit of parallel compression. You've seen this in previous tutorials, but if you're new here, there's a link in the top right. First up, we have the drum bus, just a tiny little bit of drive, a tiny little bit of crunch, and we're just dampening this drum kit a little bit. I've got a clean envelope in the audio effects rack, which we don't do anything with, and then I've got a glue compressor envelope, which just has the glue compressor in it. It's going to make your drums sparkle a little bit, have a little bit more presence. What's really lovely is we have this shaker sample here. If we turn off all of the processing, but it's really just the same sample. So to get a little bit of movement, what we're going to do is add the compressor. This is tied to the kick drum, adds a little bit of a ducking effect for when the kick drum plays. Got the shaper on a rate of quarter notes tied to the low pass of the EQ8. So again, that's going to muffle the shaker like it's moving away and towards the mic. And I'm also tying it to the gain of the utility as well. Just makes it sound a little bit more tasteful and it's not as monotonous. Just like the shaker and the snares, I'm using hi-hats from Ableton's collection as well. We've got the 505 and the closed beyond hi-hat. Very simple and on the grid. You can see that I've really constrained the high end on the EQ there and used utility just to put this hi-hat in mono. And then I'm using the open hi-hat on the offbeat just to give that classic house feel. Put those two together, you get this. You can see the open hi-hat closes at the point the next closed hi-hat comes into play. No processing on that, just kept it in a group to keep it nice and neat and take the volume down a little bit. And then we're onto the tambo, which doesn't come until the second drop, the more bassy section of the song. We've just got this break beat, again from Ableton's collection. Originally there was a kick in there, so I've just high passed that EQ. It sounded like this. Then we turn that EQ8 on and panned it to the left a little bit. So it's just an extension to my drums. Little fill, just 2 snares there. And as well as the entrance of the tambourine, I'm just automating my shaker up just a couple of decibels as well. Awesome, so we're onto the basses. Second basses. They didn't always sound like this. Let me go back and show you what I was doing wrong. When I started this tutorial, I was listening to Fred Again's track All Wrong. And I think some of you might be doing the same things with your tracks. So hopefully you feel kind of similar. This was my original bass line. Now, if you're wearing headphones, there's nothing actually wrong with this bass line. I like it, but it's a little bit too grimy. I was mishearing Fred Again's track. You can see how loud the track is once I've downloaded it, and this is upon the first drop if you want to listen to it. I obviously can't play it on the channel. But I was trying to listen for the bass line whilst I was listening to the energy, the vocals, the drums, the percussion, the melody. So then I realized I should probably practice what I preach. I applied an EQ8 and rolled off everything but the bass, and this is what Fred Again's bass line sounded like. There's definitely an 808 going on, right? With a kick drum perhaps. So I started playing different 808 one-shots through Splice whilst Fred Again's track was just looping over on that section. And I landed on the Super Mario 808 Crazy Tune C from Splice. Sounds very similar, especially if we apply that same EQ8. Very similar, right? And then I just started to match the pattern of Fred Again's 808 with mine. Didn't worry too much about tuning, but just seeing if it would sit the same. So I know I'm in a good place. From there, I hit Shift-Command-T and applied that Super Mario 808 to a new sample track, which obviously allows me to play it in via MIDI. The other thing that I did with Fred Again's track was then just take the mids and see what else I could hear inside the track. So around that 250 mark to 2.4K, you can kind of hear this warbling. That tells me that there must be another bass line, something like a respace amongst the madness as well. That really started to change the direction of the tutorial that you guys are seeing. So let's dive in and see what I was doing with my basses. So we'll come back to processing, but as I explained, I've got that Super Mario 808 here, tuned it to the key of C, and then I've played it in as MIDI. And here's what the pattern looks like. It's the same pattern that we kind of copied underneath Fred Again's track. Plenty of space to breathe and to add our pitched 808 because Fred Again's track kind of starts with that boo. Then I froze and flattened that first MIDI note of the bass and put it on a new track. And then I could use the envelope to transpose the pitch of that sample. So we get a sound like this. I've also intentionally rolled it down to -7 semitones rather than an octave or 2 octaves as I would normally do a tape slow effect. This will pitch down into the key of B, which is where our high melody is going to set that vocal sample. Towards the end of the second bar, I've got an offbeat stab of that 808 bass, again, pitched up 7 semitones and then detuning sort of halfway between the bar. And that's just panned a little bit left. Okay, let's talk about processing. Now my bass group on its own, a little bit muddy and not too impactful. First up is the overdrive, 24% drive, and I've just rounded off that EQ a little bit so there's not as much high end. Already added more aggression. I've turned up the dynamics, turned down the dry wet. Multi-band compression, going to give you a little bit of control on those mids, highs, lows. You can see that I've turned my mids down a little bit, turned my bass up a tad. At this point, you're probably going to want to add a limiter just to limit some of that aggression. I've taken my ceiling down to -5.4 because I can see that the threshold is just kicking in a little bit, so I'm not going to get any distortions there. And then finally, and I think most importantly, is I'm preserving some of my highs and side chaining my lows. So you want to create an audio effect rack. You're going to put 2 chains in here. One's going to be the high chains. To create a new chain, just right click in this box, create chain. We're going to have highs So it's just going to be an EQ8 and you're only going to have the highs here. And then we're going to have another chain, which is just going to be the lows. Now we can control our lows. So I've added a compressor, which is sidechained to my respace for the second drop. That means when my second bass plays in the latter half of this demo, then it's going to duck the volume of all the lows. So it's not going to sound all muddy, but it's going to preserve all of the high energy stuff, all of the static kind of sound distortions. And that's going to make sure that nothing is distorted. Notice how it backs off on that first 808 pitch drop, which is really great. So you still get the clarity and the warmth there. So my basses are tied to that second respace. With the respace, we've got an EQ8. And again, I'm just using a little preset from Splice. This is the TP Slide D&B bass. I've turned mono on and legato by accident there and set the portamento to always, it's up about halfway. So it's got a long glide. I've increased the attack a little bit, and then I've just added a little bit of distortion and turned the multi-band compression on from the original preset. Now, the other thing that you'll notice is the EQ8 is also ducking on the respace, because there's no point in me having the bass be replaced from the bass group to the respace, but now I've also got so much bass occurring with my original kick drum. Remember, we were going to come back to this. So the respace is being ducked at this point of the EQ. So the respace is listening out for the kick drum, just being sent by the envelope follower. Every time the kick drum plays, I'm mapping this envelope follower to the kick. I've got a little short on that. It's up in the top right for you guys. Okay, still we've got so much to get through. I hope you're enjoying this video. Do let me know what you want to see in future. If you are, don't forget to like and subscribe. It greatly helps out the channel. All right, this is where it gets a little bit exciting. This is my vocal group. So what I'm using here is a splice sample, and I'm cutting that splice sample up. I had a few passes at this. It wasn't always sounding like this. It doesn't actually sound too bad. It's just different. So first time round, I actually used a contact instrument called the Voice of Rapture Soprano. We've put that in the bad vocals column. Once I went to Splice, I found this lovely one shot, a nice ooh. And then I'm cutting up sections. But I did have a little bit of a learning curve as we went on. You can see that I haven't taken just the same part of the sample each time. So you want to give it a humanistic feel by taking different parts of that sample when you chop it up. It's all in the same key, it's just a different vibrato section of the voice. Makes it sound very natural. How am I processing this? Well, firstly, I'm putting the utility set to mono. I'm using OTT to bring out mostly the brightness of this vocal. Valhalla Vintage Verb, 17%, quite a lot of decay to give it lots of space. And then a line delay, 4 milliseconds to the right. Why am I putting it in utility and then applying a line delay, you might ask? So if we just apply the align delay, I'm getting both stereo images of the pan, which means this left section is much louder than the right pan, which when we listen to it, the vocal slightly leans to the left, even with the align delay. So by putting it in mono, I can apply a nice wide vocal, but it sits evenly in the middle. You can tell with this sample, I've also pitched it similarly, but not the same as Fred Again. So at the beginning, I'm coming up from that -7 semitone mark. Remember my bass that was pitching down Remember my bass that was pitching down -7 semitones. So again, we've gone up to meet that 0 semitone mark around the halfway point. And again, at this point, pitching down from -9 semitones, the B, down to that 0 section. And then underneath, I've got a lower version of that vocal. So all I've done is freeze and flatten that whole section, pitched it down 12 semitones or an octave, and then taken the gain down. Of course, construed the EQ, just taking the mids there, a little bit of OTT again, Valhalla again, and a line delay is turned off. It's just in mono. Vocal group, again, we're using that parallel compression method. I'm using a clean chain and I'm automating this clean chain a little bit so we can start to roll off that vocal as we go into the second part of the song. With our parallel compression section or our glue compression section, I'm really boosting the highs here so I can get more out of my glue compressor. Same settings as you saw before, a little bit more makeup gain this time. And again, that EQ8, which is just copying the one above. Cool, so now we go into the second part of the song, which is arguably a little bit more bassy. Only a few more instruments to go, but this is definitely the magic of the track right here. But first, I just want to say Fred again could definitely do well as an indie artist, but he's definitely had help from E1 and Atlantic if you give him a quick Google. And I want to tell you how you can get a little bit of help today as well from our sponsor, DistroKid. DistroKid have this fantastic tool called Upstream. And this is really cool that they recognize this because DistroKid help you self-release your music to over 200 streaming platforms. But they recognize that might not always be the goal for an indie artist. So Upstream helps you get in contact with record labels as well. I actually think it's really fantastic that they do it because they recognize that the artist's ambition might not always be to remain on DistroKid. Regardless, I think DistroKid are doing wonderful things. That's why they've always been a continuous sponsor. And if you want to get 7% off your first year, then just use the VIP link in the description below. Let's get back to this video, we've got a lot to cover. Okay, so real quickly, we've got this multi-saw. I kind of took a shortcut here because, of course, featuring on Fred Again's track, it's not just Future, but Swedish House Mafia as well. And you hear that Swedish House Mafia sound come into the latter part of Fred Again's track. And I just didn't really have the time when I created this track to really dive into the Swedish House Mafia sound. So what I wanted was just a little pluck instrument to stand out with some delay that would fill the space of the second half of the song. So I'm using the multi-saw, which is just an operator pluck, I believe, or it might be a wavetable pluck. I've changed some of the filter options, but I've essentially kept it on default. And then again, I've automated the EQ. So we kind of get a filtered out sound towards the end of these bars. You see I'm increasing the amount of the effects too. It's more delayed towards the end. We've covered the additive of the respace, but just that pluck on its own wasn't really enough for me because there was no introduction to that new sound. So I was really straining my ears and listening to Fred Again's track, and I noticed that there was kind of like a piano chord or maybe a synth chord. All I've done is taken the stock Ableton piano, a little bit of volume automation at the beginning so we don't get any attack there. I'm just playing 4 notes from the C sharp to the F sharp, the A and the C sharp above. Some automation there, just bringing in a little bit more bass, making it not as high pass towards the end. So you can see that with that same chord, what I've done is drenched it in 100% wet reverb, cut it towards the end of the reflection, and then turn that gain right up. And then I've done a separate chord and done the same thing again. And that just kind of adds to the overall feeling and atmosphere of the second drop. Now, obviously, one of the important things is that I automate my vocal down so it kind of sits under everything. We're going to get more of the bass section in this second drop than we did in the introduction. So automate that vocal to filter out a little bit, maybe a little bit more reverb, and make sure that in your mind you've got an idea of what instruments are going to be in the forefront and what instruments are going to be in the background a little bit. Then I just tie everything together as I always do at the end of my tracks with some risers and some atmospheres. So we've got a quick sober rise as part of the same sample. I think I'm just taking this section, popping it at the beginning, reversing it, and that's going to explode into our louder sober riser there, which I've just reversed. That's going to go the whole length of the bar and fade out to silence. And don't forget, this atmospheric swooshy noise is landing on the snare beat of the drums, so it's super explosive. It's super loud and obnoxious, maybe a little bit too loud for this mix, but that's the whole track. Let's have a recap of everything together. And don't forget, if you want to help this channel to grow, surpass 15,000 subscribers, which, by the way, thank you so much. Couldn't have done it without you. Do subscribe. I think it's something like 73% of my audience isn't subscribed. So yeah, if you keep coming back, do consider it. there we have it, guys. We've come to the closing chapter of another video. What do you think of Turn On The Lights again? What do you think of the direction of this video? I know I haven't done a lo-fi video in a couple of weeks, so what do you want to see next week? Shall we return to lo-fi? Maybe look at Laffy, Mondo loops. I'm also thinking about having a guest maybe once a month. So if you want to see another guest on the channel, let me know who. You ultimately control the direction of this channel. I just like to bring a few new artists along the journey as well. But as always, I thank you so much for stopping by. Don't forget about the Patreon, where you can download racks, templates, projects, including this one with the samples and the Frozen session. And I think there's a few spaces for one-to-one tuition left as well. So grab that while it's hot. Ultimately, be well, and I'll see you next time.